Wall Street is watching carefully as the Feds hold the line on interest rates. So it was a mixed day of trading. The Dow dropped more than 127 points to close at 34,930. The S&P was down less than a point to close at a little over 4,400. And the Nasdaq rose more than 203 points to close at more than 14,762. Shares of Apple way up. The Federal Reserve says the economy is strengthening. It also says the country is making progress toward employment and inflation goals. The Fed says ongoing COVID vaccines are helping the economy. There was no movement in the current low interest rates. And if it seems like everyone around you has an iPhone or a MacBook, it's not your imagination. Apple has had its best quarter in its 45-year history. Apple earned $21.7 billion in profit for the 3-month period ending in June. That's up 36% from a year earlier. The Cupertino-based company is on pace for its best fiscal year ever, with a profit of $86 billion. The iPhone maker's fiscal year ends in September. They've gotten a lot of my money, unfortunately. I've had a lot of iPhones in these years. Well, there's a lot of Happy Meals among shareholders this evening. McDonald's posted better than expected sales in the second quarter after the introduction of the crispy chicken sandwich. Crispy McChicken sandwich. Easing pandemic rules and opening McDonald's to in-store dining also helped their numbers. The Chicago-based company jumped 57% to nearly $5.9 billion in the April to June period. McDonald's says same-store sales are up 40.5% from 1 year ago. Same-store sales mean that McDonald's, which have been open for more than a year, saw 40% more revenue than at the height of the pandemic. And it was a story about a con man, but was it really just another con? That's the premise of the book, The Greatest Hoax on Earth. The book says the real-life character, played by Leonardo DiCaprio in Catch Me If You Can, was almost all a lie. Did you follow that? Author Alan Logan joins us now from Manhattan. Alan, welcome. This is quite a book we got going on here. There was debate in the newsroom about even doing this because people are saying this is like saying the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy aren't what they seem to be. So I want to ask you about this. We'll start from the top here for those who are not familiar with how this all goes. Real quick, give us a summary.
Sure. Well, the primary claims made by the central character that he traveled the world for 2 years as a Pan American Airlines pilot, or an imposter thereof, worked for 1 year in Baton Rouge as an assistant state attorney general, and then almost a year in a Georgia hospital as a supervising pediatrician. And then also the other wrinkle is 2 semesters at Brigham Young University as a PhD holding sociology professor. So those are the claims, long-standing, and started to gain traction when Mr. Abagnale made his way onto The Tonight Show, To Tell the Truth, and various other talk shows, and then subsequently wrote an autobiography, which was the basis of the film that you mentioned, Laverne.
Okay, so is the story about Frank Abagnale's being a commercial pilot and the prosecutor, all that stuff, even a surgeon, is all that part of it a lie?
Well, there's tiny grains of truth to it. Even though Mr. Abagnale made his way onto the Google campus and is a Google Talks that's been viewed over 13 million times, and he's made the claim that he was an assistant attorney general and so on. So to answer your question, research shows through public records, so this isn't just Alan Logan making this up on the fly, I was able to identify certain victims of Mr. Abagnale, and they had held these letters since 1969, and they placed Abagnale in Comstock Prison in New York between the ages of 17 and 20. So the notion that he was traveling the world as a teenage millionaire imposter, just bottomed out at that point. And the tiny grains of truth are, when he was 22 years old, he did dress as a Pan American Airlines pilot for about 3 months, and he cashed 10 Pan Am payroll checks for less than $1,500. Those were incorporated into the federal court records that I was able to obtain. And surprisingly, Laverne, at each stop along the way, whether it was the New York State Archives, the National Archives of the United States, the archivists were, each one of them that I spoke to anyway, they were surprised that no one had asked for these records before, and certainly not anyone at the Comstock records that placed them in prison for 3 years between 17 and 20. And the other thing that came out too was that Mr. Abagnale was in the Navy, the U.S. Navy, prior to all this. So it's pretty difficult to obtain all those occupations when we know through public records where he was now.
Oh my goodness. So in real life, this is kind of like a Horatio Alger story where the criminal is reformed and then helps the FBI catch the really bad guys. Is that kind of what's going on here?
Well, no one really knows what Mr. Abagnale has done or not done with the FBI. They've never made an official statement in Washington, D.C. at FBI headquarters as to what he's done. He's claimed that he is an ethics instructor at the FBI Academy. That's to the press. Now, whether or not that's true or not, I don't know. I wasn't able to obtain it. And I'm, to be honest, less interested in what he has or hasn't done with the FBI. I'm interested in the way that in our culture, certain truths that are really falsehoods get elevated, and then harsh truths are papered over. And it concerns me. It's part of the post-truth. So you're right. I mean, in one sense, it is a little bit like, hey, there's no tooth fairy or Easter bunny. And I've had that said to me many times, Laverne. But I do think that we need to reckon with these things, because this is being celebrated as a true story on stages all over North America. And, the question is, are there victims here whose voices were not being heard? And in what way does this undermine trusted institutions that we should be relying on?
Well, Alan, I got to ask you, I mean, give me an example of what you think is happening now in our time that is reflective of what you're saying, where, truth is not quite what it seems.
Well, it's a great question, Laverne. And one of the books I'm reading at the moment is Clint Smith's How the Word is Passed, which is just getting rave reviews, and rightfully so. And Clint Smith, in that chapter, in the book, he has a chapter on Angola prison and the atrocities long-standing atrocities, the way that it papers over slavery on those premises. So this is Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. And to keep it brief, Mr. Abagnale in Louisiana was arrested and convicted for stealing from a local family and a small business in Baton Rouge. Mr. Abagnale was sentenced to 12 years. He would have been headed for Angola prison, but Mr. Abagnale was given 12 years of probation and psychiatric treatment. So my question is, how did that happen? And how many people, given the fact that Angola prison was then in 1969, and still is today, over 75% black, my question is, how did that happen? And how many stories are there in Angola prison of someone that would have been 22 years old that didn't get that chance? So these are the type of things. And then ultimately, whose story is not making its way to a stage to be celebrated, and so on. So that that was some of the things that really stuck out to me, were examples like that, Laverne.
Was that example something you might write about?
Yeah, I think so. And what's interesting is, and I really appreciate the fact that your network, I mean, you said that you debated whether to do the programming in this segment, based on the fact that, hey, this is going to be upsetting to certain people when they find out the truth. But there is a courage on your part to actually discuss this. And NPR did the same thing. And so far, really, yourself and NPR are the only ones who have kind of really addressed this, despite the fact that, as I mentioned, that his talks at Google have been viewed millions of times, up just this year, over 5 million. So I think the next stage in this is to start understanding how it is that certain things are guarded, certain fantasies, if you will, in our culture are guarded and kept in place. I mean, I'm nowhere near the elegant writer of Clint Smith, but I do plan on starting to discuss, I guess, in some sense, the lack of interest in knowing the truth, and to talk about how, in a greater amount of detail, about how this is connected to our post-truth world.
Yeah, well, we are uncovering truth all the time here. In fact, that's our slogan here, BNC Truth. So, yes. Alan, we appreciate you joining us, author of The Greatest Hoax on Earth, and we appreciate your insights into what this is all really about. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Laverne. I really appreciate
Take care.
it.
And we have invited Frank Abagnale to appear on BNC to give his side of the story, but so far, we have not heard back. And stay with us, everyone. More news is straight ahead. We'll be right back. This is BNC.